Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to a new edition of Africa Today, where we get you the latest news taking place on the African scene. And our main topic today will be related to bombings and attacks and against civilians continuing all over the world. But we'll first have a look at this report. The UN Children's Charity has said that some 11 million children are at risk from hunger, disease and water shortages in East and Southern Africa because of the strengthening of El Nino weather phenomena. More details in the following report.
The United Nations said that conflicts, floods and failed rains caused by El Nino have sparked a dramatic rise in the number of people going hungry in East Africa. El Nino, a global weather pattern that periodically wreaks havoc, is expected to last until early 2016. Since May, numbers in need have already risen by 6.7 million from 18.5 million to 25.3 million people. While some countries, including Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia and Djibouti, have seen drier conditions, other countries, including Kenya, Somalia and Uganda, are at risk of floods. Over 90,000 people in war-torn southern Somalia have already been hit by weeks of severe flooding, almost half of them forced from their homes. In neighboring Ethiopia, El Nino has wreaked havoc on summer rains needed to grow crops, with around 8.2 million people needing food aid, nearly double the number in need 6 months ago. El Nino is triggered by warming in sea surface temperatures in the Pacific Ocean. It can cause unusually heavy rains in some parts of the world and drought elsewhere. The UN Children's Agency UNICEF warns that 350,000 children in Ethiopia are expected to require treatment for severe acute malnutrition by the end of 2015, with hunger, disease and lack of water likely to kill many. The UN has said in South Sudan, where a nearly 2-year-long civil war rumbles on, some 40,000 people are already starving, with tens of thousands more on the brink of famine.
Now we move on to Nigeria, where President Muhammadu Buhari has expressed conviction that the Boko Haram insurgents are very close to defeat. Details.
Nigerian troops killed 4 suspected Boko Haram suspects and set free 61 people, mainly women and children, held by the group Boko Haram in the Flash Point, northern eastern Borno State. In an operation, troops under air cover cleared Boko Haram camps and in the process rescued 61 persons abducted and held captive by the Boko Haram terrorists. The Nigerian army has said before that it freed more than 330 people, mostly women and children, from Boko Haram's forest stronghold in an operation in the vaulted northeast. On the survivors, 192 were children, while 138 were women. There was no independent confirmation of the army claims. There has also not been any indication that any of more than 200 schoolgirls seized by the group in April last year in Chibok town, Borno State, was among those rescued so far. Their kidnapping of the schoolgirls from their dormitory sparked international anger, with strong condemnation of then President Goodluck Jonathan for his slow response to the girls' plight. The Nigerian military has in recent months claimed a string of successes against Boko Haram in its quest to end the hardline group's 6-year insurgency. In early August, the army said it had freed 178 people, including more than 100 children. President Muhammadu Buhari, who came to power in May on a pledge to crush Boko Haram, has given his military commanders until the end of December to defeat the rebels.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. You're still watching Africa Today live on Nile TV International, and we're glad to be joined today by Ambassador Ahmed Hagag, former Secretary General of the African Society. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you.
Sir, before we start our main topic, which is bombings and attacks that we are seeing all around the world, we would like to shed some light on the Valletta conference that took place in Malta last week regarding the immigration of Africans to Europe. What were the most important recommendations of this conference?
This conference was held at the summit level between heads of state and government in Africa and heads of state of the European Union. And the European Union wanted the conference to adopt a resolution concerning African immigration to European countries, stressing the importance of having processing centers on the African soil before allowing the African immigrants to go to Europe. Therefore, the African immigrants have to be sheltered in those centers while their application for asylum, immigration, and so on will be processed. African leaders oppose this strongly because they consider that these centers will be a detention center, and the African applicants will be liable to rape or killings or attacking against their economic viability and so on. The conference adopted the resolution, I think, to have an emergency fund of $1.8 billion to assist African countries to find jobs for the potential applicants. But African countries are a little bit suspicious because the fund will not be commensurate to the needs of African countries, and they depend on the remittance of African immigrations to Europe to uphold their economies and economic ratings.
Right, sir. And we move on to our main topic, which is the terrorist attacks taking place all over the world and continuing. How do you expect officials to handle the situation to cripple the terrorist acts taking place in Africa and, as we've seen, of course, in Paris, everywhere?
I think European countries, after the Paris incident, will tighten the flow of immigration to their countries, either from the Middle East, Syrian and Afghanistan and Pakistan, or from Africa, because they are very much worried. They said they discovered that some of the terrorists responsible for the Paris incidents came from the Middle East or Africa. Therefore, we have to expect that they will tighten the screws on allowing immigration. And some European countries are refusing categorically to allow one Middle East or even one African refugees in their country, especially Poland and the Slovak Republic, and they target the Muslim immigrants in particular.
Right. Now, a UN-AU report found that $1 trillion flowed illegally out of Africa due to corruption and illicit transactions. How do you see this report, and how do you see this issue of, is it related to money laundering? Is it supporting terrorism?
Most problem is through corruption, where money is smuggled by some leaders or high officials to European or non-European banks. And some is laundering of drug trafficking. Africa now in some areas are used as a transit from smuggling of drugs from some Latin American countries, using Africa as a transit to Europe. So this is laundering money is wanted to be processed in so-called legal projects in European countries or non-European countries in the Middle East and African countries as clean money coming back as an investment from Europe.
Right. Now there's corruption and illicit funding all over the world, but why is it very prevalent in Africa?
Because there is no tight process of against this phenomena. The banking system is still fragile in many African countries, and even some of the banks are accused of processing such money, laundering money from drugs. And the African Union have already an agreement concerning laundering money and corrupt money, but the screws are not tight enough to prevent such a smuggling of money abroad.
Do you think this problem is closely related to long-staying rulers, African rulers, or maybe fragile governance?
It could be one of the reasons, although it is, the phenomena is not all over Africa. There are very good rulers, there are conscientious rulers, but high officials in customs, in illicit trade of goods and drug money, who are the major source of such money. And it's not only African officials who are involved. They need the cooperation of European, Latin American officials in order to launder this money in European banks and projects and come back to Africa as a clean money to be invested in legal projects.
Right, and moving on to Boko Haram, they have pledged earlier, of course, their allegiance to Daesh. Why do you think this is so significant?
Boko Haram is operating strongly, trying to terrorize Nigerian citizens, especially girls and women. And they are a ruthless organization. They have no conscience against killing innocent people. And they spread outside Nigeria now, in Cameroon, in Niger and Chad. And they have the cooperation of some local authorities, unfortunately, for political reasons. That's why they are surviving till now. But they have cooperation with Daesh and Al-Shabaab in Somalia. They're extending their allegiance to Daesh. Before they're doing that to the Qaeda. Now it's only to Daesh, and they're cooperating with some similar ruthless organizations in Africa and beyond Africa.
Right. How could this be a game changer in the fight led by the regional coalition, Niger, Chad, and Cameroon, in their fight against Boko Haram?
The West African region cooperated in establishing a military component to fight Boko Haram in those regions which I mentioned before. But the African, the ECOWAS, which is a regional organization in West Africa, did not take a particular shape and organization in order to be formed efficiently and being earmarked specifically to combat Boko Haram. And Boko Haram is still working. There are still countries like Chad and Cameroon, they are fighting back. The Nigerian army is fighting back, but not in an effective way, which lead to diminishing the power of Boko Haram among the local population and among those areas which allow them to smuggle arms for fighting the illegal governments, or they're using also laundering drugs in order to finance their operations.
Why has Boko Haram long opted for this allegiance with Daesh?
Because they consider Daesh is their model. They wanted to imitate Daesh and their ruthless. They are committing terrible killings and mutilating corpses and so on. And
what would be the benefit for both sides?
They wanted to show the fear of Daesh among the innocent civilian population. And Daesh, it is trying to use this as its ability to extend its authority beyond Syria and Iraq in African countries. And now with the Paris, they are trying to claim that they are managed to penetrate European countries through refugees or through its own local cells in Paris and some other European countries.
Is this allegiance, you think, a propaganda boost for both Daesh and Boko Haram?
Sometimes. Sometimes Daesh is claiming a lot of incidents which I doubt they have the capacity to do that, but they're using this as a propaganda to show that it's a mighty organization. Even European intelligence organizations have not managed to penetrate it or to combat it. And sometimes they do use some of the silent I think they call it silent cells in some European countries by disgruntled, and they're using some of the European so-called volunteers, which worked with them in Syria and Iraq, and they return now to Europe in order to commit such atrocities in Belgium or on France, as was claimed after the Paris incidents.
Right. Mr. Ambassador, with your long experience with the African countries, would you please give us an insight on the roots of these groups like Boko Haram, Al-Shabaab? Where did they spring from?
Africa was not known as a continent where there are terrorist attacks. This phenomena started only 5 or 6 years ago to 10 years. Some try to attribute it to unemployment. Many communities are very fragile. They are on the fringe of the society. The central government is not giving enough care about the plight of those fringe people. But certainly some are using religion as a motto to try to have those people think that they are devoting their lives for the sake of religion. By the way, Muslim and Christian, it is no. We have some also terrorist Christians organizations in Africa. So it is, those people are mostly ignorant. They have no education or scant education. So it's very easy for such preachers to penetrate such societies in order to mobilize them to work against established regimes or governments, or even in a competition with other religious organizations in the same country.
Are they composed of foreign or local fighters?
Both, mainly local, but they are supplied with some foreign fighters which can give them the capacity to organize efficiently to fight against, like in Somalia. There are some European elements from Sweden, Nordic countries, or even from the United States, working among the Somali Al-Shabaab in order they have a training, their commitment, and they can organize financing from outside Somalia to such an organization.
Right. Boko Haram has been active in Nigeria since 2002 and is expanding more and more. From where is it getting its funding? From where is it getting its weapons?
It's getting the funding through blackmail. They blackmail local economic interests. If you don't join us or finance us, we'll kill you and annihilate your family. And also among smugglings from outside neighboring countries, there is a lot of small arms floating in Africa for almost a decade now. And this is small arms. They don't need an atomic bomb or a plane or a tank in order to intimidate people or massacre people. They need only small arms, and sometimes they use machetes in order to massacre people. And this is available in the local market.
Right, sir. How similar or different is the ideology of these groups from Daesh in terms of their crimes and their brutality?
I think all of them are brutal and very ruthless, but I think Daesh is number one in ruthlessness, and the local African insurgent groups are, I don't want to say they are less ruthless, but they are not that sophisticated as a Daesh organization in the ruthless attacks against innocent civilians. Daesh used rape as an element, as a weapon, and they tried to enslave women, giving them to their fighters, and so I think both of them are trying to imitate
the ideology is the same. Is the ideology similar?
No, ideology in Daesh, you can find people trying to justify on religious fatwas or so-called dubious Islamic doctrine. In Africa, it is the using enforcement measures in order to, so in Daesh you can have some convicted people who believe in the Daesh doctrine. In Africa, I think it is more enforcement measures by the preachers and the leaders of Boko Haram and Al-Shabaab in order to make people or compel people to fight in their ranks.
Right. Now, Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram rose as local groups fighting local grievances. What are the chances that they expand to a transcontinental fight?
As I mentioned before, Boko Haram extended their influence in neighboring countries, in Niger, in Mali, and in Cameroon, and in Chad. So they're expanding. Even Al-Shabaab expanded to Uganda and some neighboring countries in Kenya and Ethiopia, trying to punish the countries which sent some forces to be joining the African Union force in Somalia, and so in order to deter them from cooperating with the African Union in the fight against them.
Right, Ambassador Ahmed Hagag, former Secretary General of the African Society, many thanks for your insight and for your presence, sir.
Thank you very much.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, with this we wrap up this edition of Africa Today. Many thanks for watching and stay tuned for more coming up here on Nile TV International.